This is the first of a series of videos looking at my central PhD interest, that of trauma narratives. Centrally, I'm going to argue in this series that an understanding of trauma can inform the writing of not just trauma narratives, but of internal arcs generally. Writing characters for any medium or genre can be informed by what Jonathan Shea calls the undoing of character. As a platform from which to launch into further depth on trauma and character, I will introduce some fundamental conceptual building blocks that will be necessary for later videos. These will include my ongoing dissection of two divergent descriptions of moral injury, while in turn relating these to a character's internal arc, wound, ghost, shadow, and persona. So, within the entire Walking Dead universe, I will look at Daniel Salazar's character and past as possibly the darkest shadow of any of the ensemble, from either the main or spin-off series. As with all the characters noted here, Daniel Salazar potentially has two distinctive identities to refer to, and in post-apocalyptic fiction there is always, of course, the life before and after the inciting incident. My initial spark of enthusiasm for recording the video itself was my enjoyment of and response to episode 4 of Fear the Walking Dead season 3. From a narrative perspective, it's interesting that this has received so much praise when, on the surface, it's functioning in some ways like the much criticised filler episodes of The Walking Dead season 7. Without knowing in advance the importance of the Gonzales Dam community to our Otto Ranch compound main A plot, you could assume this capsule episode also detracts from our investment in the fate of the Clark family, in the same way that narrative black holes have sucked the narrative energy out of Walking Dead season 7, right? Well, no. There are key differences I'll discuss down the line. But what interests me in the comparison of the two shows is that Daniel's arc, in its use of mirroring and inversion, shares some important properties with Rick's arc and Shay's undoing of character. In future videos, I am to demonstrate that such physical mirroring, such as Rick's season 7 bookended kneeling before Negan, and Daniel's midpoint and final scene kneeling resurrections, are key to the mechanics of the successful internal arc in trauma narratives. I will argue that the crucial ingredient comes into play when the setup of physical mirroring occurs with the prospect of a character inversion payoff. When our protagonist reenacts what haunted him in the first place, but works through the fear and comes out strengthened, then we have our trauma completion. The other huge narrative difference between the two protagonists here is that Rick's arc in season 7 is frustratingly punctuated by digressions and diversions throughout, whereas Daniel's completion is very, very neat and satisfying. If the Walking Dead season 7 writers had put all their energies into building narrative tension, servicing the clarity of Rick kneeling and broken in episode 1, and Rick kneeling but with almost maniacal conviction in the finale, then fan response would have been starkly different. Alternatively, Daniel's visibly physically low position at the beginning and end of the episode titled 100 is serviced fully by the writer's exploration of his character throughout. This underlines some straightforward realities of character. Although it is absorbing to create and analyse nuance in performance and character, clarity of comparison is important for the character's arc and therefore viewer enjoyment. A huge majority of the beats in season 7 distracted from and detracted from the progress of Rick's internal character transition. Alternatively, almost every single action and line of 100 was built around Daniel's internal arc. There is an abundance of meaning in this self-contained capsule episode that can be interpreted by the viewer, allowing active engagement that lingers long after the final scene very succinctly cuts to black. A precision I enjoyed as I turned to my wife and almost sighed breathlessly, now that's an arc. But what is an internal arc? It seems facile and obvious to indicate it involves change itself, but one way of mapping that change is through a straight inversion of a character trait or character concept, a process I will argue is key to both trauma and a fictional character's undoing. You choose your key concept for an arc For example, Rick's in Season 7 might be conviction or hope, and represent as a time bar. The key then is cutting out the middle to structure how the concept shifts from first to last scenes. Another good example for an exploration of this and Shay's concept of the undoing of character would be The Walking Dead Season 3. Here, the Governor acts as both a mirror and mirror inversion to Rick. Laurie's death in episode 4 initiates a descent into madness for Rick that is juxtaposed with the stability of both the Governor's early demeanour and the environment of Woodbury. In fact, later indications are that the Governor experienced a similar trauma before stabilising the community. Protagonist and antagonist, both apparently suffering trauma induced by this post-apocalyptic world, begin and end from mirror opposite poles, from the beginning of their arcs to their completion. You could outline several concepts here, but madness and its impact on leadership would be apt for many of the lead antagonist and lead protagonist character interactions in that season. Rick is visibly unhinged due to Laurie's death and the pressures of leadership in a stressful environment, this madness notably forcing Tyrese and Sasha into the arms of the surface rational Governor and his Woodbury idyll. As the season progresses, the final third sees Rick regain his sanity and competence, but the Governor loses it entirely, demonstrating his absence of sanity and finally, absence of moral leadership by killing his own people. Returning to Season 7, we know that Rick's direct opposing of Negan has resulted in Rick's broken will in the first third of the season's arc. This returns strongly in the final third, paying off with a near duplication of Carl in jeopardy, but with a completely different result. Rick is not broken but determined. Enter Tiger, which is a nice signalling metaphor. As I'll argue in later videos, this mirroring of a physical act, but with an internal character inversion payoff, is key to both trauma narratives and to trauma recovery. And Fear the Walking Dead Season 3 Episode 4 is replete with mirroring, which is the focus of the next video. Deeper than the basic internal arc though, Rick's broken will tied into his responsibilities as leader and interest of Jonathan Shay, author of Achilles in Vietnam, discussed later. In his early Alexandria behaviour, Rick very much mirrors the Governor in Season 4. We therefore have the risks already played out for the viewer on a different stage. With Alexandria's Jesse and Sam being both mirrors for the Governor's Lily and Megan and all four being post-traumatic proxies for characters from backstory. As a viewer, I was personally sympathetic with both protagonist and antagonist here, who at different points struggled in vain to maintain the safety of their communities. But their previous traumatic losses saw their behaviours spiral out of control in over-enthusiastically trying to prevent a repeat of their previous trauma. This is where internal conflict comes to mirror external conflict in both fiction and trauma. Jesse, Sam, Lily and Megan represent not only ghosts of the past that might succeed in overwriting past trauma positively, but also previous versions of Rick and the Governor that they both unconsciously want to return to and are also alternatively terrified of. E.g., they desperately want to return to the romanticised stability of the past, but are terrified of returning to the loss tied to it. The traumatised character's desperate attempt to not have a particular situation play out again is also a desperation not to return back to their own internal experience of pain. Yet the memory of that pain drives their bad decisions. This, we will touch on later, is key to what is known as the wound. The controversial Season 6 finale offered a tantalising glimpse of Rick on the road to recovery from this pain. The last episode had its very own neat and encapsulated arc for Rick, from optimism and hubris to confusion and despair. The actor Andrew Lincoln certainly couldn't complain of any absence of depth to convey here, having, as he has, perfected his own now very recognisable set of non-vocal performance tics to indicate internal conflict. We can literally see him squinting and glaring as he absorbs the enormity of what this finale means and how his own decisions as leader got them there. But ultimately, Rick Grimes is about to swallow a large dose of moral injury. We look at what moral injury actually is in relation to several characters in this narrative reality, finally settling on Daniel Salazar and the way this influences his internal arc. The question of moral boundaries has featured centrally in the Walking Dead fictive world since the very first season, but with the addition of this spin-off series, we now have Salazar possibly at the very top of a list of characters who are psychologically ill at ease with their previous moral decisions. Beyond the fact that, observed by the Walking Dead fanbase, our lead protagonists massacred Negan's men without real provocation at the outpost. Many have their own individual personal crosses to bear. Carol, one of the top candidates for moral injury, previously killed her own people to prevent the spread of disease. Oh, and killed a child who was becoming psychopathic. Morgan, who arguably had the strongest moral core of all, revealed his character's new, unhinged but sort of logical, moral decision to kill his own tribe member Richard. Eugene, disappointingly revealing his old subservient character, pledged allegiance to the guy who bludgeoned his best friend to death. Dwight, whose moral decline had been poignantly illustrated by Sherry's letter, grudgingly follows Negan's orders to murder innocents, and Daryl could barely look or speak to Maggie after knowingly breaking Negan's rule of non-interference, which resulted in Glenn's horrific death. So, these characters, along with Daniel Salazar, who perpetrated atrocities as a member of an El Salvadorian death squad, have made morally dubious decisions. But what is moral injury? Broadly, this involves a transgression of moral beliefs, but I want to address two distinct positions on moral injury. The first is from Jonathan Shea and his acclaimed comparison of the Trojan War to modern combat in Achilles in Vietnam, combat trauma and the undoing of character. The second is from Carol Gilligan and her article in the Journal of Social Philosophy titled Moral Injury and the Ethics of Care, reframing the conversation about differences. Despite distinct positions relating to combat and development, my interest is that the transgression of moral beliefs leads to an internal violation of identity. This violation provides some interesting opportunities for fictional narrative. Shea's insights fall very much into the category we are by now very familiar with in both fictional accounts of combat-induced PTSD, such as Jacob's Ladder, and non-fiction biopics like American Sniper. But he importantly adds the traumatic element of internal betrayal felt when one observes violated moral values, a common theme in both The Walking Dead and Fear the Walking Dead. Shea, indeed, argues that dramatic representations of wartime experience, such as in Daniel's El Salvadorian Civil War, were originally intended as catharsis for warriors returning to civilian life. If Shea is right, then war trauma itself is the classical Greek source of our modern drama. Once we take Gilligan's observations of violated values in childhood and adolescent development into account, the spectrum of trauma broadens widely to include a range of experiences that many writers will recognise as what is commonly called the wound. A callback to that classic of literary criticism, Aristotle's Poetics. The original Greek term for this, hamartia, was apparently confused by later interpreters, but in so doing came to be known as the fatal flaw of the tragic protagonist. Shea himself refers to such a narcissistic wound involved with moral injury. He relates this to another Greek term, thumos, which he indicates is close to our modern-day conception of narcissism. Shea goes on to categorise one of the thumotic emotions of rage, two others being elated pride and crushing shame, as triggered by the awareness that, quote, "My ideals, ambitions and attachments are being very quickly and disastrously deteriorated, and what's more, it's that person who is responsible for that deterioration." While it's difficult to indicate that Daniel Salazar's actions are motivated by Shea's form of thumotic killer rage, I think this definitely applies to other plotlines in the Walking Dead narrative world and especially the confrontations Rick repeats with lead antagonists from the new communities they discover on their journey. Carol Gilligan's inclusion of character inauthenticity as the central site of trauma fits surprisingly well with another popular focus of character arcs, that of the false self, or mask that the protagonist wears. While the false self is apt for discussion of narcissism, we had in use the practice of writing protagonists who maintain such a lie right back to Henrik Ibsen and earlier. What Ibsen called the life lie is a mask of idealism to protect us from the harsh realities of our existence. Some examples would be Ibsen's The Wild Duck, Eugene O'Neill's The Iceman Cometh, and Arthur Miller's All My Sons. For me, I see this issue in a number of contemporary twist movies, something I will return to in my later look at trauma narratives on film. Gilligan herself lists a number of fictional female characters in literature who she sees as exploring the inauthentic life lie. The earliest being Iphigenia in Euripides' drama Iphigenia in Tauris, then the eponymous heroine of Jane Eyre, Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird, Frankie in The Member of the Wedding, Rahel in The God of Small Things, Claudia in The Bluest Eye, and Tambu in Nervous Conditions. So, we have some background on living the life lie and exposing it, but where does this place Daniel Salazar? It's easy to see why a character such as Salazar, having previously been a member of an El Salvadorian death squad, would seek out a new identity with his migration to the USA. The officer became a barber. The line delivered by Daniel to Afrain in episode 4 of season 3 is actually a much more complex statement than it first appears, conveying two very different selves. More recently, screenwriting guru Michael Haig has pushed this idea of a persona, the word itself originally meaning literally mask, and uses this concept centrally in his screenwriting seminars. Appropriately for our focus on Daniel Salazar and his previous self within the death squad Sombra Negra, translated as Black Shadow, Haig's interest in Jungian persona draws many threads of trauma narrative together with the persona's counterpart, the shadow. Whereas the persona is the positive mask, or, for our purposes, Salazar's barber persona, used to shield ourselves from darkness, Jung's shadow aspect is everything we reject in ourselves, what we could say is Salazar's murderous death squad officer identity. Amartya's shadow, or in screenwriting your protagonist's ghost, the aspect of the protagonist's backstory that haunts him or her, are all convergent ideas that can be informed by a look at moral injury. K.M. Wayland, author of Creating Character Arcs, believes that the life lie relates directly to, and in fact can be explained by, the ghost. She claims the arc is itself proportionate to the ghost, which is proportionate to the lie. And Daniel Salazar's arc in this episode is impressive, as is his ghost. But what is his lie? My own research traces the way that we both construct the lie and yet put in a huge amount of cognitive effort into ignoring, or in technical terms avoiding, both the truth behind the lie and the pain central to its construction. I will argue that Daniel's pain is linked to his own moral injury, first suffered in El Salvador, and this injury is what causes him to be split between the officer and the barber persona. Daniel Salazar hid his old El Salvadorian identity from his daughter, Ophelia, because he believed that the old self was not worthy of his daughter's love. His confession to Ephraim is essentially a narration of these two selves, the officer and the barber, in collision. In further parts of this series, I will break down Fear's episode 100 and bring the idea of moral injury together with the episode's religious allegory and various points of intentional mirroring and inversion.